The rehearsal dinner was my idea. Claire had wanted to keep it small, just immediate family at the house, maybe order in from that Thai place she loves on King Street, but my son-in-law-to-be had insisted on the private room at Canoe. Top floor of the TD Tower, 54th floor, Lake Ontario spread out below us like hammered silver in the October dark. Marcus had made the reservation himself, paid the deposit himself, and I remember thinking at the time that it was a generous thing to do. I remember thinking he was trying to impress me. I was 63 years old, 31 years with the RCMP, the last 12 of them running financial crimes out of the Toronto division. I had interviewed con artists in church basements and corporate boardrooms. I had watched men cry real tears over crimes they had committed without a shred of remorse. I knew what performed warmth looked like. I had filed it away in a folder in my mind labeled "Not My Problem Tonight" because my daughter was happy, and her happiness was the only thing I had worked for since her mother passed. I watched Marcus stand at the head of the table and raise his glass, and I watched my daughter watch him, and she was glowing in a way I had not seen since she was 7 years old, and we brought home the dog she had been asking for all year. That particular kind of joy that hasn't yet learned to protect itself. He was halfway through his toast, something about finding a home in a person, something about Claire being the coordinates his whole life had been navigating toward, when she leaned across the corner of the table toward me. I thought she was going to squeeze my arm. She had been doing that all evening. Small touches, checking in, the way she always did when she wanted me to know she was okay. Instead, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm and closed my fingers around it. She looked straight ahead, smiled at something Marcus said, laughed at the right moment. I waited until he sat down. I waited until the applause faded and people reached for their wine. Then I opened the note under the table, tilting it toward the ambient light from the window. 4 words, written in her careful printing: Dad, his name's wrong. I had spent 3 decades learning not to react when information landed badly. I did not react. I refolded the paper. I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. I lifted my glass when everyone else lifted theirs. But my mind had already left the room. Marcus Webb had come into our lives the previous February, 11 months before that dinner. Claire had met him at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital. She was on the organizing committee. He had come as the guest of a colleague. She called me the next morning, which was unusual. She was 34, and she had long since stopped calling me after first dates. When she did call, she didn't stop talking for 40 minutes. He was a structural engineer. He had done bridge work in BC before moving to Ontario. He was quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than shy, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke and remembered everything you said. He had brought her flowers on their second date, not roses, which would have been too much, but a bunch of something orange and wild-looking that she'd photographed and sent to me because she thought I'd appreciate that he'd paid attention to what she'd mentioned about her mother's garden. I liked him. That's important to say. I genuinely liked him. He came to Easter dinner at my place in April, and we talked for 2 hours after Claire fell asleep on the couch, just the 2 of us at the kitchen table with the last of the wine. He asked good questions. He had opinions about things that weren't safe opinions. When I told him what I used to do for work, he didn't perform the usual theatrical respect that people put on around former law enforcement. He just nodded and said, "It must have changed how you see a room." And I said, yes, it had. And it had also changed how I see people. And he said, "I imagine it made it hard to trust anyone." And I said, "You'd be surprised. It made it easier to trust the right ones." I thought I was telling him something generous about himself. In retrospect, I was giving him a blueprint. They got engaged in July, up at my sister's place on Georgian Bay, which had been in our family for 40 years. Claire had grown up swimming off that dock. The ring was her grandmother's, a simple thing. White gold and a small diamond, nothing showy. She told me later that when she'd mentioned her grandmother's ring once, in passing, Marcus had quietly asked my sister where it was kept and had arranged to have it cleaned and reset before he proposed. I was glad for her. Whatever small doubts I carried, and I always carry small doubts, it is an occupational habit that has outlasted the occupation. I packed them down, and I was glad. The first moment that something snagged was in September, about 6 weeks after the engagement. The 4 of us, Claire, Marcus, my sister, and I, were sitting on the deck at the cottage for the long weekend, and the conversation drifted to the family property. My sister mentioned, offhandedly, that she'd been looking into updating the ownership documents, thinking about how it would pass down eventually. Marcus had asked about it with a kind of focused attention that was slightly different from his usual listening. He asked whether there was a family trust, whether Claire would be the sole beneficiary, whether the cottage property and my house in Hamilton were held separately or together. Claire hadn't noticed. My sister hadn't noticed. I had noticed. I filed it. I told myself it was reasonable curiosity. A man planning to marry into a family would naturally want to understand the financial structure he was entering. I had no evidence. I had a feeling, and feelings were not cases. But I had also spent 12 years watching men who were very good at appearing to ask casual questions. I did not say anything to Claire. This is the thing I have had to make peace with since. I did not say anything. Not because I was afraid of being wrong. I had been wrong before, and it had cost me nothing but the embarrassment of an apology. I was afraid of being the father who poisoned his daughter's happiness with a suspicion built out of nothing more than a professional reflex. She was 34. She was careful and smart, and she had chosen him herself. I was not going to be that man, so I watched, quietly, the way I had watched cases unfold from a distance, gathering before moving. I ran his name through the databases. I still had informal access to old colleagues, old favors. Marcus Webb, licensed structural engineer, Ontario Association of Professional Engineers, registered 2019. Prior to that, British Columbia, registered 2014. The file was clean. The credentials checked out. I found a LinkedIn, a professional website, 2 project references in BC that I called and confirmed. He had worked on a pedestrian bridge in Kelowna. The project manager remembered him. I found nothing wrong. I want to be honest about that. I looked, and I found nothing, which is why I put it down. It was Claire who picked it back up. 2 weeks before the rehearsal dinner, she had been using his laptop while hers was being repaired. She'd spilled coffee on the keyboard, classic Claire, and she had opened his email by mistake, the browser having saved it as a default. She wasn't snooping. She had been looking for a restaurant confirmation she thought he'd forwarded her. What she found instead was an email thread with a woman in Vancouver. It was not romantic. It was transactional in a way that was somehow worse. The woman was asking about a timeline. She was asking when certain accounts would be accessible. She referred to Marcus by a different name, not Webb, not Marcus, a name Claire did not recognize, and Marcus had replied in a register that was nothing like the way he spoke to her. Clipped, careful, the language of someone managing a project. Claire had taken screenshots. She had closed the laptop and put it back where she found it, and gone for a 3-hour walk along the escarpment trail in the dark, alone. And when she came home, she had sat across from Marcus at dinner and smiled and asked about his day and not said a single word. She had been carrying it for 2 weeks when she pressed that note into my hand. I called her at 8 o'clock the next morning. I told her I needed to see her in person, without Marcus. She came to my house in Hamilton within the hour. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had sat with him and drunk wine and thought he was a good man, and she put her phone down and showed me the screenshots. 14 messages over 3 months. The other name that appeared in the thread was Daniel Kovacs. I looked at her and I said, "Have you looked up that name?" She nodded. She had. Daniel Kovacs did not have a LinkedIn. He did not have a professional website. What he had, buried on the 3rd page of search results, was a 2-year-old court filing from a civil suit in Alberta. A woman named Patricia Harlow had sued a man named Daniel Kovacs for fraudulent misrepresentation in connection with a joint property investment. The suit had been settled out of court. There was no further information publicly available, but the filing alone was enough. I said, "Okay, show me everything you have." I had a colleague retired like me, but sharper than ever. A woman named Diane, who had run fraud investigations out of the Calgary division for 20 years before her knees gave out and she moved to a consulting practice in Oakville. I called her at 9 in the morning. I told her what I had. She said she would start pulling threads and get back to me. What she found over the next 4 days was methodical and devastating. Marcus Webb had been Marcus Webb for exactly 7 years. Before that, he had been Daniel Kovacs for 5 years in Alberta. And before that, Andrew Firth in Manitoba for 3 years. All 3 identities were complete sins, professional credentials, employment histories that checked out on the surface, but dissolved under sustained pressure. The structural engineering license was real. It had been obtained legitimately under the Webb identity, which appeared to be the cleanest of the three. He had rebuilt himself carefully after whatever had gone wrong in Alberta. Patricia Harlow had not been the only one. Diane found two other women in Alberta who had made informal complaints that never went anywhere. A widow in Calgary who had lost $140,000 in a real estate partnership that evaporated, and a woman in Red Deer whose house had been quietly refinanced without her full understanding while she was recovering from surgery. In both cases, the man in their lives had disappeared before the full extent of the damage was clear. In both cases, the man had moved toward women with property and family money, and no immediate male relatives paying close attention. I did not tell Claire all of this at once. I told her enough to understand that she was not paranoid, that she had been right to trust the things she had felt when she saw those emails, and that I was going to handle what came next. What I did not tell her was how angry I was. Not at Marcus. I had seen enough of men like him to keep my anger clean and functional, pointed at outcomes rather than burning in my chest. I was angry at myself, because I had seen the question about the trust. I had seen it, and I had filed it, and I had chosen comfort over competence. I was not going to make that choice twice. Diane connected us with a forensic accountant named Stuart, a precise and humorless man who charged a great deal per hour and was worth every cent. We needed to understand whether Marcus had already begun to move on the financial structure, whether any documents had been initiated, whether Claire's name appeared anywhere alongside his on anything she hadn't knowingly signed. It took Stuart 6 days. He found nothing executed, which was the only genuinely good news in the entire situation. Marcus had been in the reconnaissance stage. He had been mapping the terrain, the cottage, my house, Claire's modest investment account, my pension, but he had not yet begun to move. He had been waiting, Stuart suspected, for the marriage certificate. In Ontario, certain property rights shift with marriage, and a man who understood how to exploit them would know that the most efficient moment to act was after the ceremony, when the legal relationship created leverage that courtship could not. Stuart also found something else. A numbered company registered federally, 2 years old, with Marcus Webb listed as a director. The company had no website, no obvious business activity, but it had a bank account, and it had received 3 wire transfers over 18 months, totaling just over $400,000, from sources that Stuart flagged as warranting further investigation. That was when I picked up the phone and called my former supervisor at the Toronto division. I want to be clear about something. I did not go to the police first, because the case was not ready. I had spent enough time on the other side of that desk to know what happened to investigations that arrived half-built. They got set aside, files got lost in the queue, and the subject had time to disappear. I had built it first. I had given them something they could move on. My former supervisor listened to everything I had without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Gerald, you know you should have called me 2 weeks ago." I said yes. She said, "Don't do that again." I said I wouldn't. Then she said, "Send me everything by end of day." The next part is not dramatic in the way that I think people expect. There was no confrontation at a restaurant. There was no moment where I looked Marcus in the eye across a table and watched him understand that it was over. There was a Tuesday morning, 3 days before the wedding was scheduled, when 2 officers came to the condo he shared with Claire. She was not there. She had left early as we had arranged, and Marcus Webb, also known as Daniel Kovacs, also known as Andrew Firth, was arrested on fraud charges. He asked for a lawyer immediately, which told you everything you needed to know about how many times he had been in a room like that before. Claire was with me at my house when it happened. I had made coffee. We sat in the kitchen in the early morning light and we waited. And when my phone buzzed with the confirmation, I put my hand over hers on the table, and I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that was adequate. She asked me, later, whether she had been stupid. She asked it in the kitchen, quietly. Not looking for reassurance, she was asking me directly. The way she has always asked me things directly, even the hard ones. I told her the truth, which was no. I told her that the measure of intelligence was not whether you could avoid being deceived by a person who had spent years perfecting deception. The measure was what you did when something felt wrong. She had trusted her instincts. She had gathered evidence before she spoke. She had not confronted him and given him a window to run. She had done everything exactly right, and she had done most of it alone, before she even came to me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I kept waiting to be wrong. I kept hoping I was wrong." I said, "That's what made you careful." The case took 14 months. I am not going to pretend those months were easy for her. There were days when the embarrassment of it, the wedding invitations that had already gone out, the venue deposit, the dress that hung in the closet of the spare room for 3 months before she finally called the shop, seemed to weigh more than the betrayal itself. There were days when she called me late at night and I could hear in her voice that she was doing the accounting, tallying what it had cost her, and the number kept changing. I drove to Toronto on those nights. Every time, I had been a good investigator and an average husband, and I had been a mostly adequate father when she was small, and her mother was the one with the natural gift for comfort. But I was 63 years old, and I had learned, finally, what my daughter needed from me, and it was not analysis or strategy or the professional remove that had served me well in every other area of my life. It was just presence. I drove up and I sat in her living room, and we watched whatever was on, and I did not offer anything she hadn't asked for. Patricia Harlow flew in from Calgary to testify. She was a 60-year-old retired schoolteacher who sat in the witness stand with her hands folded in her lap and spoke without notes and without tears, and I thought she was one of the most composed people I had ever seen in a courtroom. The woman from Red Deer testified by video link. 3 additional victims were identified during the investigation, 2 in BC, 1 in New Brunswick who had not come forward previously. Marcus, to his credit or perhaps simply to his calculation, did not make his defense lawyer argue the impossible. He pleaded guilty on 2 of the 4 counts, which reduced the sentence, and was given 4 years at a federal institution, which was not enough and was also something. Diane came to court for the sentencing. She sat beside me and said nothing during the reading of the judgment, and when it was done she said, "It's never enough." I said I knew. She said, "But it's something." I said I knew that too. The cottage is still in the family. My house is still in my name. Claire's investment account still belongs entirely to her, with nothing touched and nothing missing except 11 months of her life that I would give anything to return to her. She went back to work the week after sentencing. She had taken a leave from the hospital committee, and she went back and threw herself into organizing the spring gala, and by all accounts she did a better job of it than she had the year she met him there. I drove up for the event, and I sat at a table near the back, and I watched her move through the room, efficient and warm, and paying attention to everyone, and I thought about the woman she had been at the rehearsal dinner, the way she had smiled at his toast while folding that note in her hand, and I thought, that took a particular kind of courage that I don't think I've ever been adequately credited in my professional life, and it was my daughter who was doing it. There are things I would do differently. I would have moved earlier on the trust question. I would have trusted my professional instincts sooner, rather than deferring to my personal hope. I would have had the harder conversation in September, when I still had time to prevent the invitations from going out. But I also think, and this is something I have sat with carefully, because I don't say it to comfort myself, I say it because I believe it, that Claire didn't need me to prevent it. She needed me to be ready when she came to me. She needed to know that when she pressed that note into my hand, the hand would close around it and hold it and do something with it. I was ready. That is the one thing I can say cleanly. She called me last Sunday. She'd been hiking the Bruce Trail with a friend, one of the women from the committee, and she had found a section near Tobermory where the rock opened up and you could see clear across the water in both directions, and she had stood there for a while just looking, and she wanted to tell someone about it. She called me. I drove up the following weekend, and we hiked the same section together. She showed me where to stand. She was right, you could see a very long way from that spot. In every direction, all the way to where the water meets the sky, there was nothing in the way.